the Wars of the Roses. And yes, that S on the wars is correct. Because there is something preceding this, and it's called the 100-Year War. And that's because it's a continual. In other words, there's always somebody fighting somebody. But in the Wars of the Roses, there are open periods. Yeah, it roughly is 100 years, roughly 1400 to 1500. But some people are going to say, no, it's only 40 years, and somebody else is going to say, no, it's 60 years, and somebody else is going to have some other comment, which is all correct. Because there's a battle, and then there's 20 years of peace. And then there's another battle, and there's 40 years of peace. And so this is on and off for roughly 100 years. And that's why it is correctly called the Wars of the Roses. Now, some other people want this to be the Civil War. Well, if that were the case, then the war between Stephen and Maud, which precedes this, which is also civil, it's within England, and this, and then later on we have yet another one when you bring in Cromwell, Parliament versus King Charles I. So I think it's easiest if we keep it as the Wars of the Roses and not worry about civil war. Yes, it is a civil war, but it's only a. Unlike ours, it is not the, it is a. And this is fought over a number of reasons. It's not, oh, we're fighting for slavery, or we're fighting to abolish slavery. It's not that simple. There are many subtopics. Now, of course, we're all familiar with probably the biggest problem, and that is something that we call inheritance. Now, the Romans started this as far as the British system is concerned. This is a hand-me-down, hand-me-down, hand-me-down from the Romans. And so you've got, as you came in today, I gave you 2 pieces of paper with some squares on it. The British system is the system with the larger squares. Not the smaller one, but the larger one. So let's look at that one first, and so that we understand what's going on. And I didn't put names on this because I want it to be generic, so that you could plug it in, keep it, and plug it in just about anywhere. You could plug this into today and be correct with one small change, okay? And we'll talk about it when we get there. Okay. Now, this says the king died and then the prince. Well, normally it would go from the king to the prince, but in this case, and in the case of the Wars of the Roses, the son dies before the father. And when that happens, all of a sudden problems occur because it gets handed on. And who it gets handed on to is one of the causes of the War of the Roses. All right, so let's use the chart that I've given you. The king died. Normally it would go to prince, or in this case, both princes, both sons have died. So it can't go to them. So it has to go to the next generation. Well, in this diagram, one of them was found to be unfit. Okay, what does the word unfit mean? Then, not now. Then it is much tighter definition than it is now. Unfit could be physically unfit, or, more appropriately, mentally unfit. And if you want to say it is due to the inbreeding, you can do that, because some of the problems that we're talking about, some of the reasons that a king would be unfit, are inherited. And we're going to encounter that somewhere in the middle of the War of the Roses. So in the chart, we're down to unfit on the left-hand side, and the unfit then cannot serve as king, or maybe he is deposed. Well, he would be deposed by his son, usually. Well, it says here that his son, in the next row down, his son died. And so the unfit father is succeeded not by his daughter, the princess, forget that. He is succeeded by his grandson. Way down the bottom, number 2. So the king that died way up on top, because his son died, because his grandson was found unfit, because that youngest, great-grandson almost, is, why would he have, well, the only thing we know about him is that he was old enough to have a son. That's down there in number 2. So, could have been killed in a battle, could have been killed by disease, could have been killed in an uprising, could have been deposed.
Can you comment on who determines the status unfit?
Who determines the status unfit? Who determines the status of whether a king is fit or unfit? Believe it or not, usually his own relatives. George III. Now, George III, everybody knows George III because of 1776. I hope you can tie those two together. So, okay, George III had a problem. I don't want to call it a disease because that would give you the wrong impression. But he had a problem. And that problem was that he was mentally incompetent for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden he snapped out of it. And then after a while, he was mentally incompetent. Then he was back into it. His son had no choice. His son stepped forward and says, "Dad, you're incompetent. You're unfit to be king. I am going to," in the first instance, he stepped forward and became the regent. And so he acted for his father.
And does Parliament accept the son's assessment that the king or...
Does Parliament, Parliament in this case, George III,
the determination that the father is unfit?
in this case, in George III, we'll say yes, Parliament was involved. In the system that we're looking at on the paper, which is in the 1400s, like 300 years prior, no. This is survival of the fittest. And the prince, everybody assumes the prince is going to inherit anyway, and therefore, since the prince is going to inherit anyway, if the prince moves daddy over, it's really no big deal. So at this time, at the time of the Wars of the Roses, this is pretty much within the family. With maybe, when I say families, I'm talking also uncles and don't say aunts. Uncles, nephews, and if you really want to stretch it, you could bring in the church. Because some of those uncles are probably in the church. And of course, without the church's backing, the king doesn't stand a chance. Okay? All right, thank you. So, in the case on the paper, number 2 down there, the son, grandson, great grandson is the next person to inherit from the dead king. Now remember, a generation at this time is about 40 years total, birth to death, 45 years. And it's that because of the great, large, huge number of infant mortality. And then we're going to have a few battles, we'll have a few wars, we'll have a few diseases. And at this time that we're talking about here, number two is a child, yes. Yeah.
So why aren't 5 or 4 then?
Oh, they could be. And that's the War of the Roses.
Okay.
You say, why aren't 5 or 4? Well, 5 or 4, as you can see, they're coming off of the other prince. Now remember, go back. Line 2. Prince died, prince died. 2 princes died, but the only one that matters, because he had a child, the only one that matters is the one on the left. The one on the right doesn't matter. Think of today. Think of William and Harry. William's son George is going to inherit. Harry's son Archie cannot inherit. He cannot do it. Well, and it would have to be all 3 of William's children plus William. So this is why Parliament and the United States has it too. The family, as a family, cannot go on one airplane. The family as a family can go on a boat, they can go on 2 or 3 airplanes, but they can't go on one airplane, because one airplane crash would take out the whole family. Now, as long as Harry and Archie are there, it's okay. It's frowned upon. But we don't want to lose the whole family. William and Kate, what usually happens if they fly, William will take one son, he'll take George, and Kate will take the daughter and the other son. And they will fly separately, yes. And then the question comes up, well, how does that work in the United States? Well, did you know there are actually 2 Air Force Ones? Yeah. Right. One goes to A and one goes to B. But what does it do after B? It goes back to A. So that as they leave the airport, you don't know which plane anybody is on. They don't know who they're bombing. That is correct. If they plant a bomb, if they can. Okay? That's exactly why they put up the fuss when Charles and Diana and William wanted to go to Australia. Exactly.
And more recently, William, Catherine, and their George went to Australia on the same plane.
Yes, but one stayed home. The young girl. William, Catherine, George. Well, but you've got Harry. And that's why you catch me oftentimes saying heir and a spare, heir and a spare. Harry is in an unenviable position. He's very, very important until William's first child is born. And he goes from being number 1 to being thrown out. This is exactly the same in every generation. This is what Princess Margaret put up with. And she got tagged as a rebel. She got tagged as a recluse. She was drunk all the time. She was on drugs. She was sexually active. She was this. She was that. Hey! As soon as the queen or the king has a child, you're out. Today, you're out. Because of something we don't have, and that's infant mortality. In the days that are shown here on the paper, that's why I put it in there. The prince died. The prince's child died. Over on the right side. Now, two things can change this diagram. One is a law, which was passed not too long ago. In other words, just before George was born. They passed a law saying that the eldest child, so you don't have the diagonal through number 1 anymore. It's the oldest child. It is not a boy, it is not a girl. It is the eldest child. Okay? That's important. That's very important today. But the War of the Roses doesn't deal with the laws today. It deals with the laws in 1400. And if you remember the laws in 1400, the woman, in this case, any woman, anywhere, had no rights. She got to be queen because there was no competition. Or she was stronger than the competition. Queen Elizabeth I became queen, not because of herself, but because of her sister. Mary Tudor took the crown from Mary Stuart. Using this diagram right here, the heir to the throne when Henry's son, Edward, died, should have been the son of Henry's sister. James. Now it's funny how fate has a way of twisting and turning, because on Elizabeth's death, James became king anyway. It took a while. Yeah, that's the right kind. It did take a while. But you've got to remember that it is very, very important. Now, let's go back. Let's go back to, on your diagram, the number 5. That would be like the uncle of the king, down there at number 2. Great uncle. All right. Or if you really want to, let's jump way up to number 4. It doesn't matter. But these people are saying the same thing. If number 1, or if number 2, or if number 3, slips up, you've got a whole other side of the family ready to step in. Okay. They had lots of children, yes, especially when you have, one of our families is going to have 7 children. 7 boys, 7 boys. Now, I've chosen, because we've got to just slice into British history somewhere in order to tell this story, I've chosen to come in during the reign of Edward III. Now, Edward excuse me, Edward III is going to reign from 1327 to 1377. That's on that half page. It's horizontal, but it's only half a page. And notice that he had 6 sons. So in terms of heir and a spare, you can see he had quite a few spares. And more importantly, what do you do with those spares? Well, usually, by the time you got to number 3, you're making gifts. Oh, I hate that word. You're making gifts to the church of your son. And he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Archbishop of York. So go ahead. Tell me that the crown and the church are not tied together. You go right ahead. Edward III has 6 sons. Only one of them, in theory, is going to inherit the crown. And he'd be Edward IV. Whoops, stop, wait, problem. Look at Edward, the Black Prince. Now, first of all, let's get rid of the Black Prince. That does not mean he was a black person. It means he wore black armor in battle. Nobody else wore black armor because it was more expensive. His side could always tell where he was because there was nobody else all in black. Edward the Black Prince died. What a way to go. Of dysentery on the battlefield. All of a sudden, dysentery on the battlefield, yep, it's a major thing. It is major. It would wipe out whole armies. Or weaken the army enough that the opposition, well, you've got the idea. But Edward was an adult. Edward is not a child. Edward, before he left home, had a son, Richard. Richard II. Obviously, Richard I is Richard the Lion-Hearted, good King Richard from the Crusades, and Robin Hood. Okay? Richard II. And I put in there that he inherited it from his grandfather in 1377. If you wish, look back up to Edward III, and you see he died in June of 1377. So here we have a son, Edward the Black Prince, who got bypassed entirely. And it went from grandfather, Edward, to son, Richard. Grandson, Richard. Now, before we leave the page, if I didn't do this, I would be, I'd be committing a major problem here. It says, John of Gaunt, June 3rd, 1340 till February 2nd of 1399. Third son of 7. Go back up to Edward the Black Prince. Eldest son of 7. So Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt were brothers. Got it? Edward the Black Prince and John of Gaunt are brothers. And what happened back here when the heir died? It went to the grandson. It didn't go to the brother. John of Gaunt is the brother. John of Gaunt is jealous. John of Gaunt is saying Richard III is too young. He is only 10 years old. At 10 years old, he cannot be king. I should be his regent. I should be his guardian. But Richard's mother didn't trust John of Gaunt for some pretty good reasons. Yes. Wait a minute. I got two questions coming at me from the same time. Let me take the front one first. Shakespeare has had fun with all of this. Shakespeare was interested in one thing, and that was making the people in the pit, comfortable with the reign of the tutors. That's what Shakespeare wanted. He wanted everybody to be quiet, to be comfortable, and there to be no uprising against the king. Who was the king? James. That's Scott. Okay? So let's establish the fact, and we're going to use this to do it, that Henry VIII's father was a legitimate king. Because if he's not legitimate, Henry's not legitimate. If Henry's not legitimate, Mary's not legitimate. If Mary's not legitimate, Elizabeth is not. Oh, we have major warfare. But if Shakespeare can establish the fact that everybody in that line, the tutor line, if they can establish the fact that they are legitimate, the king is happy and the shekels flow down to Shakespeare's open, welcome hands. Okay? So Shakespeare is as much a propagandist as the people are today. Nothing changes in politics. Now, back row.
So with the rule of succession and Richard II inherits, even though he's 10 years old, so John of Gaunt, I mean, what is his recourse? Just shut up and go away.
That's right.
And so why is
John of Gaunt is that heir and a spare, and John of Gaunt is the spare.
so bad?
Well, sometimes egos get in the way. I mean, do you want to be subservient to a 10-year-old? You're an adult, and you're kneeling to a 10-year-old? And your 10-year-old runs around playing with horses and soldiers and all the rest of that, and yet you're supposed to kneel to him? Oh, well, now, wait a minute, slow down. You're running ahead. I just want to set up the fact that he's sitting over here and he's not happy with the king. Okay? That's where we're at right now. Okay. Now, if you would go to the second page, the one that's full of type. And if you've gotten the right copy, I hope you have, there are two names, Henry and Edward, in the middle of the page that are extra dark. Okay, good. Then you've gotten the right version. I sent her two versions, and I told her destroy the first one because I wanted emphasis. All right. Now, we're going to go through a series of changes. What I'd like you to do is look at the far right-hand column. Just to show you Deposed by cousin. Deposed because he had leprosy. Died of a wound. Deposed. Disease. Deposed. Illness. We're not sure what. Slain. And then another one was slain. What a way to go. What a friendly family. This is a civil war. And you've seen, I showed you on the first page, that John of Gaunt, his side of the family, is going to lead the revolt against the Plantagenet family, the Plantagenet kingdom. And this is where the house of Lancaster and the house of York come from. They're both Plantagenets. Two sons. Daddy was a Plantagenet. They should both have been Plantagenet, except I'm sorry? Yes, because that's the house of Tudor. Okay. Now, before we start down page 2, got to remember a few things. As we go down through here, we have to remember that science doesn't play favorites. And if you live in a castle, it's usually cold. It's usually dank, which I suppose would mean wet. Cold, wet, most of your life living with mold. And the real question is, do you ever really get warm? Because, just for an example, if you go down 3 feet in the dirt, the temperature is a constant 55 degrees. It doesn't freeze down there. You go down to Rochester and a little bit south of there, you get into some of those caves down there. They're 52 degrees all year long. Doesn't matter what the temperature is up on, whether it's 98 degrees or 14 below. It doesn't matter. What matters? Nothing. The temperature of the earth. The only thing that's going to change that is if the core of the earth decides to cool off in a hurry. And if it does, we're all in trouble. So that castle, with its 3-foot thick stone walls, is like living in a basement without a dehumidifier. Take your hand, rub it against the wall, and the water or the moss will come off. And that's why when people were put in the dungeons, most of the time they died of respiratory failure. Pneumonia, if you want to call it that. Tuberculosis, if you want to call it that. Some people have actually gotten a different term, and they say, oh, it's called mold in the lungs. That's an awfully descriptive term. All right. So when Richard II, who was succeeding his grandfather, Edward II, at age 10, we already have a dispute right there. Because Richard's mother says, I can do a better job than John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt, we don't want you here. Go away. There's a reason that Harry moved to L.A., and it's not Meghan Markle. Oh, she didn't help. But separation helps. Archie's never going to move in the same circles that William does. It's not proper. The king is the king. He's the king's cousin, not the king's brother. And that means a lot in 1400. Now today, with communications being what it is, hey, it's no big deal. Now remember what else is going on at this time. Remember I said there was 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War is fought in France. It's not fought in England. It's fought in France. Why? Because the French are trying to drive the Normans out of the western half of France. If you took a map of France today and draw a line vertically through Paris, left and right, France is everything to the right of that line, Paris and west. Normandy is everything to the left of that line. What was William's title? William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. So his family, of which Richard II is one, were responsible for everything from Paris to Dublin and beyond, to the Cliffs of Moher. And they couldn't control it. There were battles along the right-hand side because the French wanted their land back. There were battles along the left-hand side because the Irish wanted independence. There are battles on the north side because the Scots don't think that... You got the idea. Oh, and I forgot the Welsh, yeah. So let's throw in an unhappy brother, and you got a pretty good idea of what's going on, because Richard, a 10-year-old, is trying to keep all this together. Now he cannot. He has to depend on someone else to be the governor, the military, should we call him general, in Normandy. And Normandy, oh, come on. This is where the wine is coming from. There are a lot of riches in that area. If nothing else, the rent from the land. And it's going to a 10-year-old boy, and the brother John is getting nothing other than his allowance. And John is jealous. John's son, Henry, in this case Henry IV, or Henry Bolingbroke, spelled broke but pronounced Brook, Bolingbroke, Bolingbroke. Henry Bolingbroke listens to Dad and says, "Hey, that's just a kid. Just a kid. I can move in and I can take that away. I can take that away." Richard is surrounded by a lot of advisors, but Richard is still the king. Does he make good decisions? No. Remember, there's something that comes up in 1666, just for the fun of it. Let's jump up there. It's called the Great Fire of London. And then a lot of people say, well, that took care of the plague. Yeah, it did and it didn't. Because that was the 5th time. 1, 2, 3. That was the 5th time the plague had visited London. You'll never guess whose reign it was when it visited the first time. Richard II. And everybody turns, just like now. We need something. Protect us from this disease. What should we do? What can we do? Protect us, protect us. What did he have? What did Richard II have in 1380 or 13 thereabouts anyway? What did he have? What could he do? What did they know? I'm sorry, but this is where I jump on the Catholic Church and say, if you hadn't been so damn stupid, you'd have read some of the writings that were burned in the Arab libraries in North Africa, and you would have learned about the plague. You would have known about the plague almost 200 years earlier than you did. The Muslims had been fighting it when it came from China. Uh-oh. Another China virus. Now, all of this comes together in something that today is called the Peasants' Revolt. In 1348, the plague struck Britain, the Black Plague. It's estimated it killed half the population. Half. Where did it come from? Oh, it started in any, or shall we say every, shipping port. And yeah, it was in the East End of London. And just like today, that's where the low-income people were living in cardboard houses. And it spread. Now, the only reason the king didn't get it probably was because he's living in a castle and he never lived on the first floor. Where is he living? Oh, the Tower of London. If he goes into London, but more than likely he's way out on the other side. It's torn down, can't go visit it, sorry. Near where Buckingham Palace stands today. No, well, yeah, it's in that area. It's in the area. Some earlier, but if we tore Whitehall, if we could go to Whitehall, and if we could go down deep enough in the ashes, we'd find it. So yes. The tower has always been the tower. No, this is Richmond Palace. Richmond. Now, just to fill in a little bit around Richard. Yes, he's got the plague going, but when the plague occurs, let's take and pull apart the pieces. Labor gets more expensive because there are less people to do the work. And Fran, if you got a field and Linda's got a field, you want people to take care of your field because you won't do it yourself. And Linda's got the same attitude. And so Nancy here in the middle is going to work for one or the other, but not both. Whoever pays Nancy the most. And neither of you want to pay anything. Because you want to keep the money to pay the taxes, to pay the king, and still have a profit. Room and board, yeah. B-O-R-E-D. But when half of the population is dying of the plague, Nancy, you become very, very valuable. And instead of working for them, you're dictating to them. I want a 10-hour day. I want every other Sunday off. You're just being totally unreasonable. You might even want a hole to crawl in. When it rains, you don't get wet. And if you're really, really ambitious, you might even say you want to keep some of the animals that you raise, like those chickens, for Sunday dinner, so you don't starve. You are controlling the show. And of course, who's sitting in Parliament? Linda and Fran. Do they like what you're doing? No. What kind of laws do they pass? And we experience, in 1381, we experience something called the Peasants' Revolt. And that doesn't mean the peasants were revolting. It means the peasants revolted. And they said, no. But I'm sorry. Who's the king? Who do Fran and Linda go crying to? I'm sorry, who do they go complaining to? The king. Who is the king? Richard II, who is now, give or take, 15 years old. Knows all the things about. He is totally dependent on his advisors. Oh. I'm sorry. But again, we have a situation where the advisors tell the king what he wants to hear, not what the country needs, what he wants to hear. And in this case, Bob's not here today. All right, have Bob over here. But Bob and his son say, this is not the way to run the country. And he's right. And since it's not the way to run the country, he and his son step in and depose our king. This is Mr. Bolingbroke. And this is the other side of the issue. And this is where everything starts. Not why necessarily. I have edited huge amounts. But what I'm trying to do is keep it simple so we can wade through this. 1399, that's where I rounded it to 1400. Excuse me. Now, on that page with all the names and dates and the Y's and the L's, I listed in dates. It says 21 June of 1377 until 29 September of 13. Those are the days he reigned. That's not his age, please. Those are the days he reigned. Okay? He reigned for 22 years. Richard II reigned for 22 years, so he was 32 when he was deposed by his cousin. It just means everybody was fed up with him. Now I'm going to go back for just a minute. I want you to get a good feeling for the reasons behind this. What is going to appeal to a 10-year-old? Toys? Well, yeah. Horseback rides? In other words, fun? And fun could be rides on the River Thames. You know, we already said horseback riding. Does he understand Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt? No. Can he sympathize with them? No. No. He cannot even sympathize with them because he doesn't understand what they're complaining about. Well, there's our problem. How educated was he? And I'm sorry, I'm going to do it. I'll probably have an uprising on my hand. Who educated him? His mother, who was aristocracy, who was sympathetic to the poor? Probably not. Who did she turn over his rearing to? Did she turn it over to John of Gaunt? No, which would be her husband's brother. She didn't trust John. I wonder why. Okay? Richard was so out of touch. He was dependent on and let's just try and construct this. He is dependent on a cabinet to run the nation. And that includes fight a war in France. Because if you think that the King of France didn't know it was a 10-year-old on the throne in England, you are really wrong. And the King of Scotland's looking down there and saying, hey, we ought to be able to do some damage here to this border with Northumbria. Anybody know the name Joan of Arc? Uh-huh. May I just sum that little story up with mistakes were made? Sometimes you make a martyr out of people you don't intend to make a martyr. And it comes back to haunt you. And here's Richard, who is trying to cover up the mistakes that Grandpa made. And he's trying to cover up for the plague. And he's trying to cover up for all these poor people that are dying. And then his uncle says, you're not doing it right, kid. You're not doing it right. Well, when Henry IV takes the throne away from Richard, this is where the House of Lancaster really starts. Oh, yeah, there are all kinds of things of who started what, but it changed. Let's just say the crown changes hands. It goes from one side of the family to the other side of the family. Wait, remember back here when we started this morning When we started, I said there was a prince over here and a prince over here. Well, in this case, we got 7 princes, but yeah. And it goes from this prince to this prince. Well, they're both Plantagenets, and so they both get new names. And because of it, Plantagenet dies, and we get the House of York and the House of Lancaster. And now it's going to go with Lancaster for a while, and then York for a while, and then Lancaster for a while, and then York for a while. Back and forth. And yes, I know. I've been there. Believe me, I've been there. Across my uncle's desk, I've been there. It would be so easy if the Yorks used Edward and the Lancasters used Henry. But they didn't. So you got Henry the umpteenth over here, and then over here you got Henry the umpteenth one more. And why? Because the name was used. My name's Henry. I'm the 9th person who's been named Henry. Therefore, I'm Henry VIII, whichever way. Remember the old song, Henry VIII, I am? Well, your name was Henry and you became king, so you're Henry VIII. It's not got anything to do with your family. And yet, when I was learning this, oh, did I curse my uncle. Oh, I hated it. All the Henrys are in this family and the Edwards are in that family. It would be so much easier. Yeah, but it didn't work that way, kid. Then you throw in that one guy at the end. What's his name? Richard? Where did that come from? Okay. I want to leave it there for today. Okay? I know.
Is that for another day?
Yes, I want this, the proximity of blood. Yeah, I want to leave that one for another day because that's obviously a different form of inheritance. Okay. And the only thing really that, well, the first 2 generations are the same. But notice, if you want to run ahead, notice that on the primogeniture, the agnostic, the difference is that next to the princess, something happens. Okay. Well, yeah, please. But notice, for whoever is the bottom on the right-hand side, it changes their position by a lot. Especially when you're waiting for somebody you don't like to bump off. Okay. I want to run. Now this is going to pick up, where is it going to pick up? It's going to pick up with Henry VI. So it's going to 31 August of 1422. This is where our presentation starts. And this is a 4-session video, and yeah, about 45 minutes, so time at the end. And
Nearly 600 years ago, England was torn apart by a series of bloody battles for the throne. In just 30 years, the crown changed hands 7 times. Tens of thousands were slaughtered. It was one of the most turbulent and violent periods in British history. It's known as the Wars of the Roses. The bloodshed began when a bitter power struggle erupted between the Queen of England, Margaret of Anjou, and one of the country's most powerful nobles, Richard, Duke of York. Both were fighting for control of England's weakest king, Henry VI. It's been portrayed as a simple family feud between the royal houses of Lancaster and York to snatch the ultimate prize, the crown of England. But it wasn't like that. I want to show you a very different version of history, one in which the Wars of the Roses are started not by hatred, but from a noble desire to do the right thing, in which the real villain isn't scheming Yorkists or belligerent Lancastrians, but a man so feeble-minded and vacuous he allows a wound to open in his country that takes half a century to heal. He is Henry VI, the Mad King. Summer 1450. With Suffolk gone, there's no one to keep a lid on trouble for Henry VI. Armed rioters storm the gates of London. They rampage through the city in an orgy of violence. What England needs right now is a strong king to take control and end the bloodshed. Unfortunately for England, that man is not Henry VI. His dad, Henry V, is famous for beating the French at Agincourt, but this Henry's never even seen a battlefield. He's shallow, pious and foolish, totally out of his depth. He should crush the rebels. Instead, he tries to placate them. He hands them the corrupt and hated treasurer, Lord Say. It only makes things worse. The rebels set up a kangaroo court here at the Guildhall, the commercial heart of the city. They try and they execute Lord Say and his son-in-law. Now, throw in the Duke of Suffolk, and that's 3 of the country's leading nobles murdered by an angry mob. England is dissolving into anarchy. In the mounting chaos, Henry abandons London for the safety of Kenilworth Castle in the Midlands, leaving London's mayor to deal with the rebels. The revolt comes to a bloody climax on London Bridge. The Lord Mayor and his troops push the rebels back across the river and lock the city gates, but the fighting goes on all night. And in the morning of July the 9th, this narrow river crossing is packed with bodies, and hundreds more have floated away in the Thames below. At enormous cost, the Lord Mayor has put the rebels down. For now, it's no thanks to the king. Henry may have run for it, but rather astonishingly, there is one royal who has stayed behind. His French wife, Margaret of Anjou. In the king's absence, Margaret acts quickly to damp down the chaos. She promises to pardon any rebels prepared to give up and go home. The royal pardon seems to work. Most of the rebels disperse, grateful to the Queen for saving their skins. But if anyone thinks the Queen is a shrinking violet, they're in for a nasty shock. By the time Henry returns to London, any rebels that haven't had the good sense to accept the Queen's pardon have been gathered together for the King's attention. This is the kind of decisive behaviour the country needs from its king.
All is ready, Your Majesty.
Except it's not Henry being ruthless. It's Margaret.
Come on! No!
Requiem aeternam Dones Domine Rescatem.
A woman taking charge comes perfectly naturally to 20-year-old Margaret. Her mother ran the French Duchy of Anjou while her dad was rotting in an enemy jail. Now it's her turn to step up.
Rescatem pes. Amen.
Imagine what it's been like for Margaret of Anjou, daughter of a major French noble, married off at 15 to the King of England. Sounds great. Or it does, until you arrive in your adopted country and find out your new husband's basically an imbecile. She sees it as her job, even her duty, to protect the country and the royal family from her husband's appalling weakness. It's a matter of pride. The problem is, Margaret's not the only person who's thinking that way. Richard, Duke of York, the King's cousin, and, as Henry and Margaret are childless, heir to the throne. As a seasoned military man who rules Ireland for the King, he has an extremely well-developed sense of his own importance. He's decided it's his job to come home, support the King, and save the country from further anarchy. This is unlikely to go down well with Queen Margaret.
As far as York's concerned, he's absolutely the right man for the job. What he's not is subtle.
On the 27th of September 1450, he marches into London with 5,000 men beneath his banner.
York bursts through these doors to Westminster Palace, where Parliament's meeting. He's come to sort things out, but he goes at it like a wrecking ball.
Beloved cousin, welcome, Your Grace.
He demands that the King dismisses all his old advisors and that Parliament appoints him, York, in charge of the country. But Parliament tells him to get lost. He's too late. The King's already given the job to someone else.
Just 16 days earlier, Henry gave another of his cousins the job of managing England for him, Lord Somerset.
My Lord of York.
Somerset's just returned from a disastrous French campaign where he lost the key city of Rouen and then committed the ultimate sin of running away.
Forgive me, Your Grace. What is this?
York is outraged. Somerset isn't the solution to England's chaos. To York, he's the cause.
Your Grace, this man is bare worthy of his title. Far less the captaincy of the realm.
One of the reasons for all the violence is the number of bloodthirsty unemployed soldiers returning from Somerset's failed campaigns.
I would name this man a dishonorable coward. Worse, a traitor.
It's a serious charge, but in York's mind, totally justified.
This sets him on a collision course with Margaret because Somerset is the Queen's closest and most essential ally. As a woman, Margaret can't operate directly in government. She needs a senior noble whose position she can exploit. Somerset's record in France doesn't exactly suggest him as a leader of men, but he is the perfect proxy for Margaret. So whether York knows it or not, by attacking Somerset, he's attacking the Queen.
Your Grace, may I take my leave?
York's absolutely certain that he should be in charge. Margaret's absolutely certain she should be in charge. Even though both want the best for the country, their good intentions threaten to tear it apart. After Parliament's rejection, York storms out of London and begins to gather troops near Dartford, just downriver from the capital. If he didn't look threatening before, he certainly does now. He demands that Somerset be put on trial, and to keep the peace, Henry agrees, but only if York disbands his army. Well, that's fine by York. He starts sending his soldiers home. He doesn't need them now. He's won. York goes to the king's tent, ready to take Somerset's place in charge of England.
Your Grace.
Instead, he finds Somerset still at the king's side. It's a trap.
I would name this man a traitor.
Somerset keeps the top job at the king's side. It doesn't go so well for York. York's forced to ride back through the streets of London between his captors, effectively a prisoner. He's brought to the great medieval cathedral of Old St. Paul's. He's forced to kneel before the king, to swear a very public oath of allegiance, and to acknowledge that any more treasonous behaviour will see him banged up for good. It's appallingly humiliating for the high-born Duke of York. And worst of all, he probably realises that it's all his own fault. With York back in his box and her man Somerset in position, Queen Margaret's got it all under control. In spring 1453, after 8 years of anxiety and ridicule, Margaret finally fulfills the most basic duty of queenship. She becomes pregnant. If she produces a boy, her position and her power as mother of the heir to the throne will be unbreakable. Fortune is at last smiling on Henry's troubled reign. But it's too good to last. New troubles are brewing for Henry 200 miles away. England has been at war with France for more than 100 years, and in Henry's reign, it's been one disastrous campaign after another. He's lost Champagne, Normandy, Brittany. Now there's just one significant part of the vast Plantagenet Empire left: Gascony.
Excellent, Your Majesty!
Henry is with a hunting party when the latest news comes from France. It's not good. His army's been routed at the Battle of Castillon. Gascony has fallen.
What?
It's the final collapse of a 300-year-old empire that once controlled more of France than the French. The greatest legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty has been snuffed out on Henry's watch. Henry collapses into a catatonic stupor.
Let him breathe, let him breathe.
Nothing can rouse Henry from his senseless trance. Not even the birth of his son, Prince Edward, 2 months later. Queen Margaret tries to keep a lid on the state of the king, hoping desperately that he will wake up. Margaret and Somerset can't enforce any decisions without a conscious monarch's seal of approval. A power vacuum is developing at the heart of government. The Queen needs to fill it, and fast.
Margaret's first move takes place in October 1453, here at Westminster Abbey, when she appoints Somerset as godfather to the new prince. Now, with the king conspicuous by his absence, this is a powerful statement. If there are any doubts that Somerset is the Queen's man, well, there isn't any more. But this is more than just a show of solidarity with her ally. This is a power play by Margaret. She's planning to govern England using the authority of the baby prince.
For that, Margaret needs the backing of the nobles. So she gets Somerset to call a great council to acknowledge the baby prince as heir to the throne and sideline the Duke of York, the previous heir, at the same time. Unsurprisingly, York's not invited, but Margaret's plan backfires spectacularly. York's allies in the council insist that he attends.
My lords, I greet you well.
And when he arrives, he refuses to debate the status of the new prince. Instead, he has one of his closest supporters denounce Somerset as a traitor again.
This time, there's no pliable king for Somerset to hide behind. And York knows it. York's move is staggeringly audacious. With one deft blow, York has neutered both Somerset and Queen Margaret. Somerset is banged up in the Tower of London. Queen Margaret is suddenly isolated from power. Desperate to claw back control, she does something completely outrageous. There's evidence of it here at the British Library, in a rare 500-year-old document.
The Queen publishes a bill of 5 articles, and they're recorded in this contemporary document. The first is that she desireth to have the whole rule of this land. She wants to appoint the Chancellor and the Treasurer and all the officers of state. She wants to decide who gets to be a bishop. And she wants to have sufficient livelihood assigned her for the king and the prince and herself. And that's a sensational list of demands. It amounts to all the powers of a king. You have to admire her. She doesn't do things by halves. To Margaret, this makes perfect sense. She sees nothing particularly strange in a woman taking power. After all, she's seen her mother do it for years. But that was in a duchy in France. She's talking about an entire country, and she's completely misjudged the reaction of the English nobles.
The idea of being governed by a woman, and even worse, a French one, is way more than they can stomach. Margaret's ideas are kicked out of the door. With the king still senseless, there's only one option left to govern the country.
On the 27th of March, 1454, York finally gets what he wants. He's made protector of the realm, and to begin with, he makes a pretty decent fist of creating an inclusive government. He stamps out some long-running, bloody, noble feuds in the north and brings some desperately needed stability to the country. Now, this all proves to York, who's not a man short on vanity, that he was right all along. He really is the best man for the job.
Trapped by the state of her insensible husband, Margaret is powerless. by his close allies like the Earl of Warwick, York is the man of the hour. He must be feeling pretty smug.
My lord, what news?
Then on Christmas Day, 1454, it all blows up in York's face. Henry wakes up. Queen Margaret's ally Somerset is back in pole position behind the throne. And the Queen is back on top, exactly where she wants to be.
York is furious. As far as he's concerned, Somerset's a coward and a traitor, and he has no business running England. But York has bigger problems. He's fallen out with the Queen, and he's put Somerset in the Tower. He can expect them to repay the compliment. So he has a choice. He can retire quietly to one of his castles in the north and sulk and pray that Somerset and the Queen don't come for him. Or he can strike at them first. Well, for a bull-headed man like York, that's no choice at all.
What York does next is perilously close to treason. He raises an army and marches south towards London. The moment the Queen hears, she sends Somerset north to head him off, raising troops as he goes.
On May the 22nd, 1455, the two sides meet here at St Albans.
York has around 3,000 men with him. He has one simple aim: take out the Queen's man Somerset and gain control of the king. Somerset is holed up in the town. He's managed to throw together an army of just 2,000. But he has the king with him. It's certainly not because Henry can contribute anything to the battle. But whoever possesses the king can claim to be fighting for the good of the realm.
They exchange messages with York, clearly trying to talk their way out of trouble. But trust between the two sides is virtually non-existent. The only thing that's going to stop York is if the king hands Somerset over. Well, that's never going to happen.
Negotiations are going nowhere.
Warwick, the choices are few.
It's York's closest ally, Warwick, that makes the first move in the first battle of what will become known as the Wars of the Roses.
York and Warwick's men make light work of the barricades. They storm through the narrow streets, cutting down the king's men. The defenders are taken totally by surprise.
York's men capture the king and secure him in the abbey. York has just one target now: Somerset. Under the medieval rules of war, a high-born noble like Somerset expects to be taken prisoner.
It's Somerset, sir. Where do we take him?
That doesn't work for York. Somerset's not the only great noble to die at York's hands. Lords Clifford and Northumberland are also slaughtered. York is victorious. Somerset's dead. He has Henry in his possession, secured here at St Albans Abbey. But he's crossed a very big red line. He's attacked the king's army. He's killed 3 of the country's senior nobles. And along the way, he started a blood feud with their relatives that'll last for 30 years. It's a bloody turnaround, considering that York's original plan was to bring peace and stability. He's done exactly the opposite. Whatever York may believe, there's no way back from this level of carnage.
Your Grace, the King.
After the battle, York and his allies Warwick and Salisbury come here to meet the king. They fall to their knees before him and profess their loyalty. All they ask in return is that he makes them his advisors, and of course he agrees. But it's not like he has very much choice. Henry VI has now become a puppet, passed from hand to hand, and whoever holds the king rules England.
York gets himself reappointed Lord Protector, but his position is legally tenuous. For a start, Henry's clearly not incapacitated this time. And when York starts giving away all the best jobs to his allies, it's obvious that this is a narrow clique, not a unified government. This will be his downfall.
Your Grace.
The first test comes after just 4 months.
My lords, I petition you all for your good assistance in restoring the fortunes of the royal coffers.
Years of fruitless war in France has left the king broke. As Lord Protector, York has the unwelcome job of trying to raise more money.
For the sake of our most noble king, I beg all of his loyal servants to affirm this cause.
He must ask the Lords in Parliament to pass an order
Your Grace.
that would force them to sign over some of their land to the king. It would be an unpopular move at the best of times, and the slaughter of St Albans means York is increasingly isolated.
Aye.
Nay. Aye.
Nay.
Nay. Nay.
Nay.
Nay.
Nay.
Nay.
His order is kicked out of Parliament.
This is incredibly frustrating for York. He's the protector. He should be running things. But without the support of Parliament, he's effectively powerless. Forced into a humiliating climb down, York resigns the protectorate and heads north. Everything he did here at St Albans, all the blood that was shed, it was all for nothing.
Technically, Henry is now back in full control of the country, which, given his track record, is a little surprising. Here at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there's a book that makes it crystal clear what's really going on. This is the Brute Chronicle, one of the earliest printed books in British history, published just a few years after Henry VI's reign. It's almost an eyewitness account of the time. This is a passage describing events in 1456, barely 6 months after York left London, and it gives us a very clear idea about what people in England thought about their king. So it says here, the governance of the realm stood most by the Queen and her council. And then a bit further down, it is to be noted that every lord in England at this time durst not disobey the Queen, for she ruled peaceably all that was done about the king. And that leaves us in no doubt. It's Margaret wearing the trousers in the marriage, but more importantly, running the country. And actually, she does a pretty good job, which shouldn't be surprising because both York and Margaret share the same aim, stabilising England. But their mutual hatred has gone too far. Controlling England is no longer enough for the Queen. She wants York out of the way, permanently. And she's more than happy to do the job herself. Acting in the name of her husband and son, she recruits an army to take York down. Margaret's troops march north and catch up with York here in his castle at Ludlow on the 12th of October, 1459. This time, Margaret outnumbers York 2 to 1. She travels with her army, and like everyone else, she brings the king along for legitimacy. York sends messages to the king claiming to be his faithful subject, but really, it's a bit late for all that. Orders are sent in the name of the king, demanding that York lay down his arms and surrender. That's obviously not going to end well for York. Unsurprisingly, he declines. From up here on the battlements, York's men can clearly see the royal standard fluttering in that field over there. And that tells them the king himself is with his army. Taking on the king directly and risking treason is a step too far for some of them. In the middle of the night, a chunk of York's troops defect. On the evening of October the 12th, realising he's now hopelessly outgunned, York decides that discretion is the better part of valour. He runs for it. But it's not enough for Margaret to have her enemies on the run. She wants to destroy them totally. So in November 1459, she persuades Parliament to pass Acts of Attainder against York and his allies. These acts strip them of lands and of titles, and their families are expelled from the nobility forever. So it's legal death. But it's still one step short of total victory, because while York himself remains alive, he's still a very dangerous man. Margaret should have killed him. The king is brought back to London in the custody of York's ally, Warwick. With Queen Margaret now in hiding, it's safe for York to return to England. But he knows it's only a matter of time before Margaret returns to take control of her husband and the kingdom. York's tried politics. He's tried force. Neither have worked. To stop the Queen, he needs to do something radical. York marches to London, not under his own arms of the House of York, but under the arms of England. Only one man is allowed to do that. The king. York has made his decision. He's going to take the crown. On the 10th of October 1460, York storms into the Painted Chamber at Westminster, his sword held out before him, and demands they take the crown from Henry and give it to him. Even his closest allies are horrified. But the truth is, York does have a genuine claim. Henry VI is only on the throne because his grandfather snatched it from the rightful king.
Henry's grandfather unrightwisely usurped the throne.
And if that hadn't happened, York's claim to the throne would be just as strong as Henry's, because both of them are descended from Edward III.
The right and estate of the crowns of the realms of England and of France belong to Richard, Duke of York.
Parliament is thrown into chaos. If they side with Henry, York has troops stationed outside, armed to the teeth. If they side with York, they risk civil war by deposing an anointed king. It takes 2 weeks for Parliament to make a decision. York doesn't quite get the crown, but he does get the next best thing. He will become Lord Protector for the 3rd time. With Henry his captive, he's basically running the country. And when Henry dies, York or his children will take the throne. It's not a bad deal for York. But for everyone else, it's a messy compromise, and pretty much all it guarantees is that the bloodshed won't stop. For Margaret, this is intolerable. Her son, Prince Edward, is effectively disinherited. Since York's return, Margaret's been hiding out in Scotland, but now she writes to her allies in England, asking them for support. She must know that York's coming for her son and for her. After all, Edward's the only remaining opposition to York's claim, and she's York's sworn enemy. York is holding all the cards. He's heir to the throne again, he's got the king in his control, and he's Lord Protector. All he needs now is Margaret. Wasting no time, York heads north himself to bring in the Queen. These are the remains of Sandal Castle, York's stronghold near Wakefield. Now York arrives here on December the 21st, 1460, fresh from his success in London, with his confidence and his self-importance brimming over. But he set off after Margaret so fast, he has just 6,000 troops with him. York's overreached himself again. As he looks out from the walls of Sandal Castle, it's clear he's massively underestimated the strength of support for Margaret. In fact, by the time he closes the castle gates, a huge army is gathering against him. York's outnumbered 2 to 1. Outmanned and undersupplied, York spends a meagre Christmas, virtually besieged at Sandal. But all he has to do is wait for reinforcements. On December the 30th, York lets his self-confidence get the better of him for the last time. One of his foraging parties is attacked. Now what he should do is wait for reinforcements to arrive before retaliating. But sitting on his hands has never been one of York's strong points. York sets off down Many Gates Lane in pursuit of the attackers. With a little less pride and a little more caution, York might actually have taken the throne. It takes less than an hour for Margaret's men to capture him. They mock York with a bloodied paper crown. Then they take the Queen's revenge.
His head is stuck on a pole and displayed above the Micklegate, here in York, with the paper crown still in place.
Margaret's final victory over York should end the violence, but it can't. The rivalry between York and Margaret has torn deep divisions across England. The fires of hatred will keep burning for decades.
So who's the real villain here? Is it Margaret of Anjou, a woman desperate to stop her husband's rule from collapsing and to save her son's rightful place? Or is it Richard, Duke of York, a man who begins with honourable intentions to save England? In truth, I think it's neither.
Both of them were trying to protect England from the real culprit, the feeble-minded Henry VI. It's his weakness that forced the people around him to try and shore up the kingdom for him, making enemies of each other and kick-starting the decades of bloodshed that we now call the Wars of the Roses. Next time, York's son Edward takes the crown with his father's great ally Warwick at his side. But the Kingmaker goes rogue, plunging the country into yet more bloodshed.
Richard of York. He's going to come up as one of those 7 sons. He is Edward III's child, and he is well, no, I guess that's the best place to put him. He's one of those kids who got bumped aside because of the rules of inheritance. And I think the thing to remember, I don't know, Richard III, that doesn't sound right. Richard, Duke of York. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right. We got to go back a few, but yes, I believe that. I will verify that over the break. Yeah, I got to get the right number. That's the thing. We got Duke of York. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. When we were in York, did we walk the walls? Yes, we did. Yes. We were up above and looking, and you kept looking out. The cathedral was always in the center. It's the old Roman wall that went around. Yes. Yes. Just, I think the did a pretty good job here. She is a French, and she's a French princess. Well, she's not French. I suppose the thing is she would be Norman, because she's from that chunk of France, the western half, but not French. So, but she's an in already with the royal family. Her family and their royal family have been trading daughters and sons for a while, since 300 years since William the Conqueror, and so her family is well thought of. So in that respect, she's got the blood, and so she's well thought of. The part that they're playing here is that she learned from her mother because she had a very weak father. Well, she had a weak father because the British king was in charge. And so the subservient Norman lord is always going to be weak. Everything's going to be run up the ladder. And after a while, you realize your dad's a puppet. And she says, when she was offered the choice or the chance to marry up, she took it. And in doing so, you can see how much power she was able to yield because she had such a weak husband. Now, there are many, we will be spending time with this poor man, but he may have had many problems, okay? And again, we can revert to the fact that it probably has got something to do with the inbreeding. The film said that he was unconscious for a year. Most places say that he was unconscious for as long as 18 months. So now you got a country without a king for 18 months. Somebody has to lead. And Somerset says it's got to be a man, and the wife says, no, I can do it. And I guess that's never been resolved. So, what's her relationship? She is queen. She is the wife of, and I guess the question that you have to be comfortable with is, just because she's queen, does that make her able? Does that make her qualified? In Somerset's eyes, no. No. But in her eyes, yes, because of her mother and the training she had got from her mother. I think she did a good job. I think she was very capable. But knowing who she was, knowing how she operated, knowing all that, and knowing the biases and the prejudices against her because she wore a skirt. She probably, could she stomach it, would have, this whole thing would have been very different had she formed an alliance with Somerset. But Somerset probably was equally bullheaded and said, "Oh, what do you know? You're just a woman." Somerset, this is Richard Somerset. He is his father. You're going to chase his father back, and you're going to get back to the guy with the 6 sons. He's royalty, but he got pushed aside. And he's looking at the king and saying, "I can do a better job." And he's right, because this king is, for all intents and purposes, an invalid. Richard. Yeah. That's correct. Probably not. No, probably not. And this Richard that you saw executed at the end, it's his son that we're going to follow now, because he's going to pick up his father's banner. That would be Edward IV, yeah. Richard, the Duke of York. Edward IV is the son of Richard, Duke of York, and you just saw Richard, Duke of York, executed. Well, she flees back to France. She's going to flee back to where she feels safe, and distance helps. She goes back to France. And, I don't know exactly what the date is, but once she's out of power, records get real raggy. It's by word of mouth. And, oh, yeah, she died. Did she die last year or the year before? And nobody cared. And so they don't worry too much. I don't know if I've got... So 1482, there. Yeah, it's 25th of August, 1482. So after her husband, about 20 years after her husband died. And her husband, deposed. Which means he died in protective custody is the term today. Okay? Now, we'll pick this. I told you there was a lot of meat here. If you can cut away the gristle. And the thing to remember about the Wars of the Roses is that there are many strong people like Richard that aren't kings, they aren't princes, they're dukes, which is the brother of a prince or the son of a prince who's not in the running. And it confuses the daylights out of people because he is Prince such and such, the Duke of, well, wait a minute, how come he's got 3 titles? Oh, he hasn't, he's got 6. And you could refer to him by any of the titles and it would be fine. And that's why when you get to like Charles, I mean, when Diana married Charles, he had 13 names, but then he had umpteen titles. And so he is the Prince of Wales, but he's also the Duke of Cornwall, and he's also this, and he's also that, it is very confusing. And that's why I say I have tried to strip away as much of it as I can to simplify it and keep it clean. Well, let's just say cleaner. Okay? Okay, think we'll shut this down for this week, and please, A, stay warm, stay well, and stay wise.